Hello everybody, Professor Barth here, Associate Professor of History at Arizona State University. Welcome to Foundations of Western Political Thought. This is part 5 of our discussion on Machiavelli and the Prince, glory, fame, and fortune in the Prince. And Machiavelli has a whole lot to say on these subjects, on the significance of greatness, of fame, of honor, prestige, glory, dignity, decisiveness, resoluteness, and also on fortune, or as Machiavelli calls it, luck. All of these subjects we'll cover in this 5th and final part of Machiavelli. For a 6th part in this video series, I will give my own personal view on Machiavelli, which is a bit mixed. Machiavelli has a lot to say about how a prince should act to acquire a reputation, and the prince must have a sound reputation, must have a prestigious reputation if that prince wants to be successful. Machiavelli says, nothing gives a prince more prestige than undertaking great enterprises and setting a splendid example for his people. And so the prince, who are the most successful princes? Those who act in big ways, who undertake these great enterprises. Those are the ones that history remembers, and those are the ones who are most successful in their reign. And he gives us some examples. Ferdinand II of Spain. Remember, Machiavelli's writing in the year 1513, toward the end of Ferdinand's reign, that he says, quote, "In our day, we have Ferdinand of Aragon, the present king of Spain. He may be considered a new prince, since from being a weak king, he has risen to become, for fame and glory, the first prince of Christendom. And," Machiavelli continues, "if you consider his actions, you will find all of them are very great, and some of them extraordinary. Yesterday was Columbus Day. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who sponsored Columbus's great voyage across the Atlantic in 1492. Now, interestingly, Machiavelli does not list Columbus's voyage as one of Ferdinand's great achievements, but he has some others, and first and foremost is the Reconquista, the great war in Granada, in which Islamic rule was overthrown and expelled from the Mediterranean coast of Spain, also in the year 1492. And at the time, actually, many European thinkers believed that 1492 would be long remembered, but not because of Columbus, but because of the Reconquista. At the beginning of his rule, Machiavelli writes, he, that is Ferdinand, attacked Granada. So that was the beginning of his great action. He attacked Granada. He was bold. He was resolute. He was decisive. He acted. He was a great man, Machiavelli says. And that enterprise was the cornerstone of his reign. I'm reminded of Thomas Carlyle's famous book on the significance, the importance of great men in history. And Machiavelli is very much a believer in that theory of history. And so at the beginning of his rule, Ferdinand attacked Granada. That enterprise was a cornerstone of his reign. He made use of the pretext of religion. This is so Machiavellian. Of course, it comes from the pen of Machiavelli himself. But he made use of the pretext of religion. So Granada, again, the Reconquista, expelling the Moors, the Muslims from Spain. The pretext was Catholicism, but Machiavelli doesn't. For Machiavelli, that's just the pretext. The objective was to solidify Ferdinand's control over Spain, to stabilize the state, to embark on a great enterprise. And so he made use of the pretext of religion to prepare the way for still greater projects, and adopted a policy of pious cruelty. And if you haven't seen some of the earlier videos in which we discussed Machiavelli Machiavelli's ideas about cruelty. You're going to want to check those out. Pious cruelty. An oxymoron? Well, not in Machiavelli's eyes. He adopted this policy of pious cruelty in expelling the Moors from his kingdom and despoiling them. A great enterprise from Machiavelli's angle. On the same pretext, he attacked Africa. He carried out a campaign in Italy. And finally, he assaulted France. And so one thing after another, Ferdinand is a king of action, a prince that will be remembered by history. And as it so happens, we do remember Ferdinand in history. He might be the most famous of the Spanish kings. Thus, Machiavelli continues, he, that is Ferdinand, has always been planning and carrying out some great design, which has enthralled and preoccupied the minds of his subjects and kept them fascinated with the outcomes of his schemes. And so this is why the prince should embark on such actions, such great designs. Among other things, you enthrall your subjects. You preoccupy the minds of your subjects. In the minds of the people, you are a great prince. You keep them fascinated with the outcomes of his schemes. And though he doesn't mention Columbus, it's hard not to think of Columbus in this situation and how Ferdinand, if we are to take Machiavelli's description of Ferdinand at face value, yes, that it makes sense that he was the king to sponsor Columbus's voyage. And think of how fascinated the people were when Columbus returned to Spain with news of this new world, though he didn't quite know yet that it was a new world. But that completely aligns with the character of Ferdinand as given to us by Machiavelli, and that history perhaps will attest to in an objective way. Machiavelli continues, it should be a prince's major concern in everything he does to give the impression of being a great man and of possessing excellent insight. And so here we have, again, for Machiavelli, the appearance of things is so important. And when we talk about virtue and vice, part 3, I believe, of this series, Machiavelli said, look, sometimes you need to learn how not to be good, because sometimes out of necessity you will have to not be good. Nevertheless, there should always be the appearance of virtue. And here Machiavelli also emphasizes the importance of giving the impression of being a great man. Now, if you can actually be a great man, if you could actually possess excellent insight, that's preferable, of course. But you must always, whatever you do, give the impression that you are a great man and possessing excellent insight. That's critical for a prince, for a ruler. Pictured here, of course, is Louis XII, King of France, during the age of Machiavelli. Machiavelli actually was a diplomat for Florence in the French court during Louis's reign, and it really underscored for him the importance of a reputation. Florence just wasn't taken seriously. France, on the other hand, was his great power. And on that subject of foreign policy, Machiavelli has a lot to say in the importance of a sound foreign policy and in supporting one's reputation as a prince. Machiavelli says this, a prince will also be well thought of when he is a true friend or an honest enemy. That is, when, without any hedging, he takes a stand for one side and against another. So, what's Machiavelli saying here? When it comes to foreign policy, be decisive, be resolute, don't be tentative, hee-hawing around. Either be a true friend or an honest enemy. Okay? Don't waver. Don't be doubtful in your friendships or in when it comes to being an enemy to a particular kingdom or prince. And let's say, hypothetically, you're a prince of a kingdom and two neighbors are at war with one another. What do you do? Should you be neutral? Should you stay out of it? Machiavelli says no. It says, be a true friend or an honest enemy to one or the other. Take a side, take a stand. It is always better to do this, Machiavelli says, than to stand on one's neutrality. Why? Well, if you're just neutral and you stay out of the war, the winner of that war will have no use for doubtful friends who will not support him in adversity, and so you've suffered a hit to your reputation from the eyes of the winner of that war, because you didn't get involved, you were neutral, out of, according to Machiavelli, weakness, indecisiveness. And so the winner will have no use for doubtful friends, and the loser will not take you on either because you were not willing to take your chances with him sword in hand. So pick a side, take it, be firm and resolute in that. As a general thing, Machiavelli continues, anyone who is not your friend will advise neutrality. Some of the libertarians here aren't going to like this, and I'm not sure I like it too much either. I think sometimes neutrality is wise. Machiavelli says, generally speaking, especially for neighboring states, you don't want to go halfway across the world if there's a war going on, but if you have neighbors, true neighbors, it's better to get involved, Machiavelli says. Weak-minded princes, and when you get involved, be decisive about it, okay? Again, don't hee-haw around. Pick a side, take it. Weak-minded princes who want to avoid present dangers generally follow the path of neutrality and generally come to grief. But when the prince declares himself like a man in favor of one side, see, that's key here. Look, again, we're in chapter 21, how a prince should act to acquire reputation. So Machiavelli's focused on reputation here. When the prince declares himself like a man. That's the critical part here. In favor of one side, even if this ally wins and becomes so powerful that you are at his mercy. So let's say you declared yourself like a man in favor of the side of, in this particular conflict, and the power that you allied with in that conflict is more powerful than you. Even if this ally wins and becomes so powerful that you are at his mercy, still he owes you something. He is your friend. Men are never so dishonest that they will show gross ingratitude by turning immediately on their helpers. Here I think I see a possible contradiction in that some of the earlier statements that Machiavelli has used to describe human nature, gross ingratitude, would seem to fall in line with human nature. And so I have a bit of a question here for Machiavelli. Wait a second, I thought you said this was part of human nature. Nonetheless, we continue. Even if your ally loses, so let's say you pick the wrong side in that war, you're still better off than neutrality. You will still be dear to him, that is to the ally that lost that war. He will help you as long as he can and be a staunch friend when your fortune rises again. And so it's all about reputation, the importance of securing that reputation. Now, Machiavelli does warn, here let me say that a prince should never ally himself with someone more powerful than himself in order to attack a third party, except in cases of absolute necessity. When your ally wins, you remain his prisoner, and princes ought to avoid as far as they can being under the control of other people. This was a concern during the American Revolutionary War when the Patriots were fighting the British and they turned to France. And there was concern that France would dominate the newly independent United States because the United States had turned to a more powerful ally in order to attack this third party, the British, in order to win that war. Now, as it so happens, France was such a deeply corrupted, rotten state by the 1780s that France had no capacity to dominate the U.S. And so, but Machiavelli is very, very clear about this. So you want that reputation, you want to take a stand like a man, okay? And he advises against neutrality, but don't turn to a more powerful neighbor in order to attack a third party. Okay, continuing onward with reputation. And pictured here is the king of France following Louis XII, Francis I, King Francis I. A prince, Machiavelli says, ought also to show himself an admirer of talent, giving recognition to men of ability, and honoring those who excel in a particular art. So he should have a reputation for good taste, and good taste in all sorts of different areas and realms, but an admirer of talent. Moreover, he should encourage his citizens to ply their callings in peace, whether in commerce, agriculture, or any other business. The man who improves his holdings should not be made to fear that they will be taken away from him. The man who opens up a branch of trade should not have to fear that he will be taxed out of existence. So the libertarians, I guess, are back on board now with Machiavelli. This is a very good point from Machiavelli. The significance, the importance of encouraging your people, your citizens, to engage in various arts, various trades. And you should not have a reputation for discouraging that. Rather, you should have a reputation for encouraging that. And that will grow your kingdom, it will better your reputation, and will increase your fame, your glory, your greatness abroad. The prince, Machiavelli continues, should bestow prizes on the men who do these things. So don't take their property, don't tax them out of existence. No, instead, you should bestow prizes on the men who do these things, and on anyone else who takes pains to enrich a city or state in some special way. Reward the people when they're bettering your state. Why would you discourage them? Why would you tax them out of existence? No, reward them. Reward anyone who enriches a city or state in some special way, and not just commercially, but also artistically. Encourage the people. He should also, Machiavelli continues, at fitting times of the year, entertain his people with festivals and spectacles. This is very important for Machiavelli. It wins the people over to your side. We talked about fear and love in the last video, and Machiavelli says it's more important, if you must choose. It's better to be feared than loved, but it's okay to be loved. It's good to be loved. And one of the ways to be loved is to encourage the people in all of their pursuits, but also encourage the people by entertaining them with festivals and spectacles. He should be inward with these people and attend their gatherings from time to time. And so here we have sort of the PR campaign. PR is important, all right? Public relations. Attend these gatherings. So have festivals, have spectacles, and actually attend, okay? You're not above doing this. You should. Give evidence, Machiavelli says, of your humanity and your munificence or generosity. Yeah. Avoiding any compromise to your dignity. So do it in a way in which you don't compromise your dignity. That can be a little tricky. You want to get in with the crowd. You want to go attend these spectacles and attend, be amongst the people. But and by being amongst the people, you highlight your humanity, your generosity. Yet you must do so without compromising your dignity. Dignity is important. We're talking about reputation again. So you want a reputation of humanity, of generosity, but also dignity. And Machiavelli thinks that's so important that he says, for that must be preserved at all costs. Your dignity must be preserved at all costs. We haven't really had too many dignified leaders lately in the United States, I'm afraid. Dignity is important. All right, so there's glory, fame, greatness, honor, dignity, prestige. Those are all important. What about fortune? Fortune, and here Machiavelli has some things to say in chapter 25, entitled The Influence of Luck on Human Affairs. Machiavelli says, I realize that many people have thought, and still do think, that events are so governed in this world that the wisdom of men cannot possibly avail against them. That things are so things fluctuate so wildly, and you can't predict what happens, that really even the wisest of men can fall victim to the train of events. And so there's no point sweating over anything. We should simply leave all matters to fate. Indeed, Machiavelli says, sometimes when I think of it, I incline toward this opinion myself. But Machiavelli says, no, it's not completely out of your control, the train of events. One recent example, President Trump, toward the end of his term. COVID, coronavirus. Now, in hindsight, and actually, not just in hindsight, at the time I think it was obvious it was completely exaggerated, and Anthony Fauci was just giving terrible, terrible advice. But that's an example of a train of events that sort of threw a wrench into things. Okay? So do you just simply leave all matters to fate and you say, I can't, there's nothing I can now do about it? No, there's something you can do about it. And you can prepare yourself for such events, unforeseen events. Machiavelli says, still, rather than give up on our free will altogether, I think it may be true that fortune governs half our actions. Wow, half our actions fortune governs, but that even so, she leaves the other half more or less in our power to control. And so Machiavelli just throws out a speculative number here. Fortune governs half our actions. The other half are more or less in our power to control, and so we need to utilize the other half in such a way so that when fortune takes control, we can combat fortune in an advantageous way if you're a ruler. By the way, fortune here for Machiavelli, in Christianity, we have a concept called providence, the providence of God. And that's, we affirm that God governs all human affairs. Everything that happens under the providence of God. And so something apparently disadvantageous can happen to you, and yet if you're a Christian, if you're a believer, you trust the providence of God. Romans 8:28 says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And so Christians trust providence. Here, Machiavelli, by fortune, he doesn't mean providence. Fortune and fate is not the providence of God for Machiavelli. It's just, again, the train of events. Machiavelli leaves God out of the equation here, but he still sees fortune as important. That's significant. And fortune here, interestingly, he treats fortune as sort of this third agent. Like fortune has agency in Machiavelli, strangely enough, even though fortune is not a person or a being. Fortune is not supernatural, and yet in Machiavelli's writings, fortune takes on this independent agency of sorts that the ruler must combat, that the ruler must take hold of. And he makes an analogy here. Says, I would compare her, and he assigns the feminine to fortune. I would compare her, that is fortune, to one of those torrential streams, which, when they overflow, flood the plains, rip up the trees, tear down the buildings, wash the land away here and deposit it there. Everyone flees before them. Everyone yields to their onslaught, unable to stand up to them in any way. So fortune's just, in other words, fortune, you can't resist it. It's torrential. It's like you ever visit rapids, and it's powerful. This is how they are. Yet, there's always a yet in Machiavelli. This does not mean that men cannot take countermeasures. And so fortune governs half of our actions. The other half, more or less, are in our power, that is you, the ruler, to control. And so just because fortune is like a torrential stream, this does not mean that men cannot take countermeasures. When? While the weather is fine. While the weather is fine. So when fortune will strike. It's going to hit you, and things will happen. You're like, whoa, 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 and you don't expect it. Again, using the example of Trump and COVID, okay? What you need to do while the weather is still fine, you need to take these countermeasures. Shoring up dikes and dams so that when the waters rise again, they are either carried off in the channel or confined where they do no harm. And so you need to prepare yourself. You need to fortify your state, your rule, against unfortunate events. So with fortune, Machiavelli continues, who exerts all her power where there is no strength, prepared to oppose her. So, sorry to stop here. So fortune exerts all her power where there is no strength. And the word Machiavelli uses, virtù. We've talked about virtù. Virtù is flexibility, prowess. It's not virtue. Virtue is, according to Machiavelli, a bit inflexible. It's ideological. It's based on sort of more rigid morality. Virtù has a flexible quality to it. And so fortune exerts all her power where there is no virtù prepared to oppose her, and turns to smashing things up where there are no dikes and restraining dams. So what do you need? You need that virtù. You need that strength to oppose fortune when fortune turns against you, when fortune begins smashing things up. Let me observe, Machiavelli says, that we see a prince flourishing today and ruined tomorrow. And yet, no change has taken place in his nature or any of his qualities. What happened? Fortune. Bad luck. I think this happens primarily for the reasons discussed at length above. That is, that a prince who depends entirely on fortune comes to grief immediately when she changes. And so some princes benefit from fortune their whole reign, and then they take that for granted. They depend entirely on fortune and don't realize that fortune could turn against them. And so they come to grief the moment fortune changes. They're flourishing today, ruined tomorrow. Cesare Borgia, for example, his entire life was one of fortune. He was the son of a cardinal who became Pope, Pope Alexander VI. Then he rose up in the ranks very rapidly. Now, in the case of Borgia, he actually prepared for unfortunate events. He had everything laid out. When his father died and was no longer Pope, he had the next Pope lined up. But then that next Pope died a few months later, Pope Pius, and Pope Pius died, and then a new Pope came, Julius II, the warrior Pope. And that was the end of Borgia. Borgia was not, his whole reign depended on fortune, took some safeguards, built some dikes and dams, wasn't enough. He took too many things for granted. He also became very sick with fever right at the time his father died. What more can you account for than fortune acting against him in that situation? According to Machiavelli, that was an example of bad fortune, that he became sick when his father died, and then the other pope that he had lined up died a few months later. All bad fortune, and he wasn't prepared enough. He depended too much on fortune, and he came to grief once fortune changed. Flourishing today, ruined tomorrow. I believe further, Machiavelli says, that a prince will be fortunate who adjusts his behavior to the temper of the times. That's that virtù. Must have virtù. You must adjust your behavior to the temper of the times. But you'll be unfortunate when his behavior is not well attuned to the times. So it's all about virtù. It's all about flexibility. You must adjust your behavior accordingly to the temper of the times, according to necessity. This is really the thesis of Machiavelli's work. It's why you must learn how not to be good. Not for the sake of it, but because sometimes it might be necessary for you not to be good. And so you must have that knowledge of how not to be good in order to adjust your behavior to the temper of the times when necessary. Do that, you can handle fortune. whether it works in your favor. And when it's working in your favor, while the weather is still fine, you build up those dikes and dams. If you don't do that and bad fortune comes, you come to ruin. It's an interesting part of Machiavelli's The Prince, chapter 25, The Influence of Luck on Human Affairs. If a prince conducts himself with patience and caution, and the times and circumstances are favorable to those qualities, he will flourish. So if the times, the circumstances, warrant patience and caution, and you have those qualities, you will flourish. But if times and circumstances change, if fortune changes, and that's not in your control. In fortune, according to Machiavelli, governs half of all actions. That's not in your control. You can't help it if times and circumstances change. Cesare Borgia could not help it that he got sick when his father died. He could not help it that his father died. He could not help it that the successor that he had handpicked to become pope died a few months into his papacy. All that was beyond his control. Times and circumstances change. You will come to ruin unless you change your method of proceedings. You must have that virtue. So long as fortune varies and men stand still, they will prosper while they suit the times and fail when they do not. The importance of virtue, the importance of flexibility. Fortune varies, and so you must vary as well. Okay? If you just stand still through all of it, it's not going to work out well for you, according to Machiavelli. Compelling argument, I must say. But I do feel this, Machiavelli concludes, that it is better to be rash than timid. It's better to be rash than timid. Why? Well, for fortune is a woman. And the man who wants to hold her down must beat and bully her. We see that she yields more often to men of this stripe than to those who come coldly toward her. Like a woman, too, she is always a friend of the young, because they are less timid, more brutal, and take charge of her more recklessly. What a statement from Machiavelli. What's the old saying? Fortune favors the bold. Fortune favors the bold. Machiavelli has feminized fortune, and the feminine nature of fortune means that the aggressive, bold ruler who takes charge of fortune in a decisive way will benefit far more than the more hesitant, timid, tentative type who doesn't act when necessary, who doesn't have that quality of virtue, that quality of flexibility. Fortune favors the ruler who is less timid, more brutal, and willing to take charge of her more recklessly. There you have it. Machiavelli Part 5. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all for a sixth and final part of Machiavelli, in which I'll give my personal thoughts on what I make in Machiavelli. Everyone's going to have different opinions. I'll give you mine in the next shorter video. See you then. Bye.